So ever since the end of the referendum, the Brexiteers have been slowly trying to change their arguments and trying to shift blame. But these arguments aren't going to wash too much longer because, well, I agree with Chris Grayling, the guy who wrote this article, and this article's called The 6 Deadly Sins of Brexit and Why They Won't Wash. So the first deadly sin of Brexit is it's too late now, they claim. So the first and simplest form is that the vote has now been held, so we must live with the consequences in whatever narrative. In this narrative, all debate and discussion ended with the referendum. Remainers must get over it, leavers must be happy with whatever happens. This position is exemplified by a recent tweet by the pro-Brexit journalist Julia Hartley-Brewer in response to being sent data about the foreign direct investment since Brexit. She responds, "Mate, I don't really care. This question was asked and answered 2 years ago. Move on with your life." As simple as it is also naive. Politics doesn't work like that. It's that simple, and it is an incredibly naive argument. And I've seen people do this. I've seen people do all these arguments. So, as Brexiteers should appreciate, not since the night before the referendum on the 2016 vote, Nigel Farage declared otherwise, and on the night after the 1975 referendum, so did Enoch Powell. In this, if nothing else, Enoch Powell, to coin a nasty little phrase, was right. Not only does politics not work like that in general, but it especially does not in this case, because as much as Brexiteers dislike it, winning the vote was the first and easiest part of a process which in one way or another will last for years. And of course this comes up into their next often so said claim: it's not up to us. This takes the form of the denial of responsibility, with the central idea being that the Leave voters and their leaders have now done the simplest part of delivering the vote. It is up to the politicians and experts to now make that happen. This too is misguided. As I've written elsewhere, their victory was in many ways a disaster for Brexiteers. What it means is that they are now responsible for whatever happens. Not just responsible, but uniquely responsible. They were warned over and over again of the consequences and insisted that these warnings were not just wrong, but malevolent, and indeed self-interest fear-mongering. So now, they and they alone own the consequences. Remainers have absolutely no responsibility to try and make Brexit work or get behind Brexit. And of course the next claim is the typical backseat Brexiting, or in this case it hasn't been done properly. So the denial of responsibility feeds into the third emerging Brexit narrative, that there was nothing wrong with the decision, but it is in the way that it is being delivered by the government which is causing problems. This is evident in, for example, Daniel Hernan's recent attempt to deflect blame of policy he advocated for so many decades, and has many variants from the outright mad of "we should just have walked away the day after" to the more sophisticated complaints about specific decisions such as the timing of the Article 15 notification. Nevertheless, these are two obvious objections. The first one, not least the Leave campaigners, have ever specified any way of undertaking Brexit which does not damage the UK economically, politically or strategically. Second, every misstep the government has made has been the result of pressure from and cheered on by the Brexiteers ultra. This includes the dogmatic red lines laid down by the government, the premature triggering of Article 50 and the subsequent calling of a general election to quote-unquote crush the saboteurs. So the next one is, it's the Remainers' fault. How is it our fault, you may be asking? Well, that's what I keep on asking. So the fourth excuse would have been all well, but for Remainers who are accused viciously of sabotage, treachery and of talking down Brexit, is a variety of the paranoid idea about the elite, meaning that the civil service, judiciary, the BBC, the CBI, the IOD, the House of Lords but not mysteriously the ex-public school boys, millionaires, hedge funders, and of course all these people who supported Brexit. Bear in mind, recently these guys are angry that millionaire George Soros is now backing the People's Voice campaign, but for some reason it's okay that Aaron Banks and many other billionaires who with agendas of their own want to have Brexit, mostly to get rid of the regulations so they can make more money and screw over the working people for them. But you know, whatever. So that's the next one. So the next one is it's the EU's fault. So the fifth narrative, and probably the most dominant of the post-referendum excuses made by Brexiteers, is that the problem is not with the decision to leave, but it's not solely, or even primarily with the British government or with Remainers, but with the EU, who have decided to quote-unquote punish Britain for leaving. Such claims are nonsense, since they ascribe to the EU the consequences of having to leave the EU. And in a sense is another denial of responsibility. To take just the most current of numerous examples, Brexiteers claim that border controls, especially in Ireland, are something being threatened by the EU rather than a consequence of the legal examples cited of leaving the single market and the customs union. The core difficulty with this punishment narrative for Brexiteers is that they repeatedly promised that Britain holds all the cards and that the EU needs us far more than we need them. If this was right, then no punishment would have been possible. If it was wrong, then vote leave did indeed have consequences embedded in it. Consequences which were concealed from voters by the Leave campaign. So the next and final one is it's not about practical consequences, but it's about philosophical principles. So alongside these five narratives, and perhaps in reactionary of their nonsense, some Brexiteers run a sixth sin. Here, the attempt is to claim that those who voted Leave did so on the basis of a commitment to sovereignty in the abstract, so consequences don't matter. Since this was a purely philosophical vote, I can imagine this might be true for a few Leave voters, though I would argue they are wrong. But it clearly was not as was proposed to by the British people by the Leave campaign, which insisted about making arguments about immigration and NHS funding, and made claims that leaving would be easy, precisely because they knew that if voters thought otherwise, that it would be disadvantageous to their cause. A pure sovereignty argument would not have been needed to make such claims. As to the practical consequences of leaving the EU mount up and can no longer be dismissed as Project Fear, what Brexiteers are trying to do is counter the argument that no one voted to be poor. This is the real meaning of the claim that the vote was about the principles of sovereignty, not about practical consequences. Since, of course, if it was about principles, it can be claimed that Leave voters accepted that it would mean getting poorer. And this is probably true that some did, but certainly isn't true of the vast majority of Leave voters. Even as regards to immigration, not yet do only Brexiteers deny this, but some even claim that impoverishment and hardship will be desirable, and in some way creating a national renewal by returning to the Dunkirk spirit. But then again, there is a good reason why this and not that was put on the Leave campaign bus. Almost no one would have voted for it. Precisely because the vote to leave the EU was the beginning of a process, the process of Brexit, rather than the end of something. The way that Brexiteers are now attempting to decouple the vote from its consequences is crucial. Brexiteers are trying to use the referendum result, as close as it was, to mandate it as the will of the people. Anything they say that it could possibly mean. This is most obviously true when it comes to the terms like the Global Britain agenda of free trade and deals around the world. There is much that could be said about it, but those things aside for now, how does the referendum mandate for that, given that some part of it was a massive call for nativist and protectionist sections of the public voted for it? This mandate is precisely the opposite. In this sense, there is a massive political fraud underway at the moment, and actually it isn't Remain voters who are the primary victims, but Leave voters. They are being told that their concerns about immigration and globalisations are going to be ignored. I happen to think that the concerns about immigrations are misplaced, and the concerns about globalisations are irrelevant to the Brexit debate. But I am not dishonest enough as to pretend that the vote was not about these things, whereas the many Brexiteers are. Thus, the day after the referendum, Daniel Hannan said that the Leave campaign never said there was going to be some radical decline in immigration. And last March, David Davis said that immigration might even rise. Both pretended that all these matters to voters, and that Britain decides its own immigration policy rather than actual numbers. As for globalisation and free trade, it is notable that just about every Brexiteer talks as if having an independent trade policy were the main rationale for Brexit. This was mentioned during the referendum, but it certainly wasn't presented as the central argument for Brexit, whereas immigration was. And it certainly wasn't explained as that such a trade policy will entail a relaxation of immigration controls. That is one aspect of an even greater dishonesty of the Brexiteers. What they are really trying to argue is that the vote mandates them to do anything they want. And that is an even bigger, even more dubious proposition than the referendum vote was set in stone as the will of the people, and with respect to leaving the EU membership. Precisely because leaving the EU has such far-reaching ramifications, not just for economics but for geopolitics, it can be claimed that anything done post-Brexit has been mandated by the referendum result. So this is where Brexiteers are now. All the pre-referendum swagger has gone, and the promises made have evaporated. In their place are such absurd and indefensible arguments, but it is important to understand that these arguments, even if they often run together, contain two fundamentally different claims. One is that whatever happens now is not the fault of the Brexiteers. The other is that Brexiteers have been given a blank cheque to do whatever they want. These claims are linked in both that treat the June 23rd, 2016 as a frozen moment in time, denoting the end of their responsibility for the consequences, or the beginning of their freedom to determine the consequences. While different, they are linked in their boundless dishonesty, and that since neither claim was entertained, let alone endorsed, by the referendum. But they are also linked in another, probably more important way. They are profoundly unrealistic, for politics did not stop after the referendum. On the contrary, it began a period of political dislocation that will last for many years, perhaps decades. Brexiteers seem to imagine that by winning the vote that it would be an end to it. It is also obvious that it is not so. If Brexit does go ahead, the Brexiteers will rightly be held responsible for every consequence that flows from it. That is significant. That is the significance of the narratives that they are already putting forward to deny that the vote had consequences. It is not simple that they don't want to take the blame, but it is they don't want to take the responsibility. The ultimate truth about Brexit is that through a series of accidents, a protest movement with a wholly unrealistic and dubious policies, unexpectedly and unwittingly became a government set upon delivering them. The Brexiteers are now running away from the consequences as fast as they can. The tragedy of our country is that in one way or another, we are stuck with having to deal with them. And that's, you know, I wholeheartedly agree with what Chris Gray wrote here. They are wholeheartedly just complete and utter nonsense, that they are fabricated. I mean, you only have to go back and watch the videos pre-referendum and the build-up to the referendum of what Vote Leave was saying, and that all this wonderful stuff was meant to be happening by now, and it's not. You know, reality, as I've said continuously, is not going to be denied, and it will knock increasingly louder on your door until you have no option but to open it. And when that happens, then Brexiteers might actually think, hold on a second, maybe leaving the EU was a dumb idea. But hey, there you go. So, yeah, that's the 6 deadly sins of Brexit, and I agree 100% with what Chris Gray has said on this. I see it daily. You're probably even going to see it now below this video. So, yeah. Have at it, guys. Remember, you voted for it. I didn't. So, it's all on you. And the consequences are all on you should everything happen. And by the way, consequences have been happening. You've just been choosing to ignore them. So, you know, we've been talking about them continuously throughout all my past videos. Just go back and look at them. You know, here we are.